Hello, fellow colleagues and research students. So welcome all of you to this gamification sharing. Now, today we have an esteemed guest here, Dr. Christopher C. And he is a dedicated medical educator. And in fact, he comes from the medical discipline. Okay, so he has a medical degree from Cambridge, a postgraduate degree in Edinburgh, and completed his PhD in medical education from Hong Kong U. And he's now teaching at the CUHK Chinese University of Hong Kong from the School of Medical Science. He teaches human anatomy and lead the university-wide AI for Education community for practice. His research interest is in the gamification, e-learning, and AI in medical education. And he received a number of teaching awards, including Excellent Teacher Award at the University of Manchester. He has a fellowship from the Academy of Medical Educator in United Kingdom, and also the Faculty Education Award at the CUHK. Now, I think Christopher today brought us two examples related to gamification. And without further ado, let me pass the stage to Christopher.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you, Joseph, for your very kind introduction. And thank you for having me at your beautiful university, which I must say I admire all the time because I live next door. And I always look out the window and see this beautiful colors. So I'm really delighted to be here with you today. And thank you to Professor Jason Chow, I think, who couldn't be here today. He's unwell. So anyway, it's really my pleasure to talk to you in the after lunch session. I'll try my best to keep you awake. I know that after lunch is always a bit difficult. And for today, I'd like to take you through two things. I think I need not much self-introduction indeed, because gamification I'll dive straight into a little bit about gamification and its role. And I want to give you these two examples, one of which, a little bit my favorite actually, right at the moment, which is gamification through escape rooms for education. So that would be something that's a bit of a physical tool. And then I think moving on to the digital side, we'll be looking at AI chatbots, and particularly what we've been doing, which is moving away from the text-only chatbots that I think everyone's very familiar with, and moving into a much more human-like material, which is a digital avatar speaking and moving version of a chatbot. And both of these have a sort of gamified feeling for the space. So very briefly, I won't touch too much on the dimensions of gamification, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, but I just want to highlight one or two things. I have a slightly controversial view on gamification. I think all of the dimensions or tools we use in gamification are important, but I would say all of them actually serve a single key point, and that is actually at the bottom, which I think is design of learning tasks. I think everything else that goes into making a gamified learning experience only supports the learning task, and therefore your gamification is only ever as good as the design of your learning task that your student is doing. The rest of it, for example, reward features, progress, clear goals, immediate feedback, either competition or collaboration, or indeed a compelling narrative, immersive experience, or just generic fun, they actually just serve the learning task that you've put in. And I think this is sort of the key thing that I always say to people: the learning task always comes first. And so this is my approach in gamification. And I'd like to take you through this idea of the escape game concept. Just by way of raising hands, has anyone played these escape games before? No? Okay, so this is quite interesting game that became popular, I think, back in the 1980s or 1990s in Japan, where it sounds a bit strange, but you form a team and you are locked together in a locked room. And you have to go around the room solving these puzzles. And it's a series of puzzles that allows you to open a box and obtain a code, get into a safe, and eventually escape the room. And this is sort of a port over from video game. Period. It's often themed with a storyline, and it often has a sort of time-restricted element to it. And of course, I thought of this as being quite important, particularly in the post-pandemic era, where I think a lot of us, students and staff alike, have been stuck at home learning in front of a screen. And I think it's increasingly important to re-establish the university as a physical learning space where people can come and have an engaging experience on campus. And I think having an escape room style pedagogy can provide an immersive and interesting environment for the students. It can get them to apply their knowledge to problems and also to foster critical thinking. And most importantly, I do believe whenever you put people in a room and give them a problem, they're like spiders spinning a web. Humans just love to solve problems, especially as a team. And I think this is the big concept. We put them in a room and they can build these collaborative skills of solving problems. So our concept really is to take a perfectly ordinary classroom, just like this one, in fact, and transform it into an extraordinary small group learning experience. That's kind of the goal, at least. And this is kind of one of the examples of what we've been doing. So I'll show you through a few more. And in terms of the theoretical framework, I think this really builds on the sort of the innovation itself, but also the way we like to evaluate what we're doing through social constructivism, really that lens of Lev Vygotsky's material, really with an emphasis on building that environment for social interaction and not just social observation that's seen in other frameworks. I think we for our team at least, believe we want to go beyond the sort of social learning theory and really get the interaction and have our students construct knowledge together in a learning space. So I think this is the framework of what we're doing. And I've had a few different examples of this. So this is the first edition, and you can see we had a bit of interesting press coverage and things like that. I'll show you this room in just a while. And this is a medically themed escape room where all of the puzzles that you see are actually individual learning tasks. So it's just like a kind of learning task we'd do in the classroom, only put in a gamified learning space. So this was one of the examples here. I've also done some escape rooms for a different level, so not for medical school students, but rather completely the opposite, for the public. So this is for a school level biology curriculum, and here we focused on the biology of the brain and invited people to the Hong Kong Science Museum to sort of go around and learn things about that. So quite a different range. You can see it's quite flexible in terms of the number. And I want to show you a few of the features of gamification which again serve the learning task. The first of which is this idea of theme and design. I think if I were to tell you, I'm going to take you immediately, lock you in a room and force you to solve puzzles, you might think I'm sort of criminal in some way. It seems like a terrible thing to say. And therefore the story and the narrative is quite an important part of this experience. So I think compelling narrative in some way. I think we had an artist do this character there's supposed to be me in some respect, sort of an evil professor who takes over the lab and captures the students, and to generate some sort of excitement and fun around the whole process. And then there is a sort of physical design for an escape room, which allows the students to have a stepwise progression and in fact gives them the feedback. So if you can imagine, a students have to come together and solve an intellectual problem of any kind. Once they progress, they obtain a code or a key or a lock and they can get through. And this is an immediate feedback mechanism. If you've got the correct answer, you know, because you've gone to the next step and the next puzzle presents itself. However, if you don't, you know you've got it wrong. So it's a built-in mechanism, and that is, it could be physical locks, it could be digital tools, it could be all sorts of things. We had indeed this quite a fancy James Bond style laser keyboard, which projects a keyboard not physically onto a surface, and you can type onto it. That was sort of amazing. So these are part of the physical design of gamification. And then there's the sort of learning design, the pedagogical design. And we visualized it in two parts. First of all, the subject. I'm a medical teacher by training, so teaching about the structures of the body, the functions of the body, the drugs we put into the body, or indeed the diseases of the body. All of these are the topics that we teach. And of course, you can apply all sorts of different tasks to them. And whilst I think as university educators, we always want our students to be high up and doing more complicated tasks of synthesis, evaluation, discussion, I think it is still quite valuable to have some simple recall tasks, some data interpretation tasks, some pattern recognition, some collaboration, communication, and so on, and even solving of clinical cases. So it's very flexible in this regard. And I'm going to show you later two specific puzzle designs that kind of demonstrate this, I think. So why do I think the learning task design is so relevant today? Before I show you the specific task, well, I think partly is that we live in this era, we were just talking about this, in the ChatGPT era, where we don't really want our students to recall so many things, and therefore tackling novel problems and ill-defined novel situations and ill-defined problems is in fact one of our key goals, even for our medical students, where medical conditions are in some ways quite straightforward. We're not physicists or we're not philosophers. We have fairly straightforward problems. Even so, applying information to novel situations is quite important. It's something we want. Learning together, communication and feedback, and having our students learning unplugged is, I think, the number one thing we want to achieve with this gamified learning experience. We have our students leave their phones outside. They are disconnected from the AIs. They're disconnected from the internet, and they have to solve the problems they're presented with the power of their own minds. And I think this is something very special that they don't have enough of. And so we're very sort of proud of this. I think this is very important. And actually, the teachers are also very engaged because when we're designing the puzzles, we are also thinking of how to engage our students with a clever design that really stimulates what we want to achieve from them, a discourse, an intellectual discourse. And you can almost think of it as a formative assessment or an assessment for learning, where the students are doing a self-assessment. Can I undertake this task? And it's a sort of way for them to learn through assessment. So let me show you how we do this. So we're thinking about what kind of puzzles get students talking, discussing, exploring, or interpreting, and potentially with a cross-disciplinary setting. And I want to show you, first of all, this slightly terrifying puzzle. I appreciate none of you are pharmacologists, I suppose. So this is a gigantic wall of drugs. And to any normal scenario, you'd look at this and say, well, this is not a puzzle of any kind. This is just a ridiculous wall of data. But actually, we set it as a question that we say the ABCD of antihypertensives. And that's all the information we give the students. So our students gather in a team of 4 or 6. They look at this wall and they say, oh, I have no idea what he wants me to do. I'm going to stay here for the rest of my natural life. And then they start to do some pattern recognition. They'll notice in the top left corner, and I'll use the mouse for this. Okay, so I'll just turn on the laser pointer. So you'll notice in this corner, the drug endings seem to have a common pattern. And you'll notice the PRIL ending, the PIRIL ending, is commonly found here on the left side. And if you follow the pattern around, there is a sort of pattern here. So this is the ACE inhibitor category. And if you go to the next side, you'll see that there's another group of drugs with a LOL ending, LOL here. And you'll start to see these patterns. And eventually our students stand around and they say, do you remember what this was? I can't remember this category of drugs, but I do remember this one. And they start to discuss amongst themselves, what are the drugs and what do they do? And eventually they shall come to the conclusion of this. So this is actually the hidden pattern amongst the drug wall, which is actually a sort of S. Then we have I in the green. You can see that's the second one. And C, quite a tricky one actually, is the X in the middle. Then we have D, which is a T over there. And the final one is Y. And so it gives you the answer of 60. So this is a puzzle. What we're trying to do here is to find a way to get students around to say, what drugs do I know? What can I recognize? What don't I know? And particularly to highlight things. For example, the yellow group, you'll notice all the other groups have a similar ending. So the LOL group, the PRIL group. Can you notice here, the yellow ones have very different sounding endings. Nifedipine is very different from verapamil, which is very different from diltiazem. And yet they're all of the family calcium channel blockers. So this is a particularly tricky one where the students really stand around and say, why do they have these endings? It's because calcium channel blockers actually are a group, but they work on slightly different receptors. So this is a way, again, a way for them to engage their knowledge. So what seems like a very simple task can actually really engage our students to stand around and talk about drugs. But if we were to sit them in the classroom with a list of drugs and say, hey, talk about these drugs, there's no way they'll behave in the same way. So this is kind of one of the great things about gamification when they're faced with this kind of puzzle. So that's one of the learning designs we want to do, which is to try and engage our students through this kind of discussion. The second one is a kind of authentic communication task. So this is a typical X-radiograph of a broken tibia, so it's leg bone. And our clinical trainees, our graduates, when they come out, they'll need to see an X-ray, report the findings to a senior. They'll need to describe the exact position, the bony injuries, and come up with an action plan. This is the typical workflow of a junior doctor as they graduate. And so the communication part and being very clear is very important. And so again, what we did for this task is we used a locked door and a model to separate the question and the answer models physically. And we gave the students a walkie-talkie each. And I'd like to show you, please, the exact gaming environment for this. I'm going to play a very short video. It's just 1 minute. And just bear with me 1 second. Might be a little bit loud. Okay, sorry. Okay, so this is our gamified learning experience. So you can see this is the wall that we talked about earlier. And here we're going to see the puzzle that I'm describing right now, which is the physical separation of question and answer for authentic communication.
Yes, we did. 427. Oh, no. Yo, this is the coolest thing ever. Woo!
Okay, find my chest. Through the circle of buttons. Okay.
經理喺呢度準備隨時俾起身。
Ah. Don't use me until you find my twin. 喂，喂，我哋呢度有個 chess model 啊。
So that's just a very brief look at the inside of the escape room and how it's set up. But I think what we're trying to do is, again, a learning task design that forces the students to convey sets of information that they can't do in another way. So not through text, they have to explain position of ribs relative to the corresponding number, relative to the location, in this case, of the heart valve. So they need to know the positions and be able to tell their colleagues who can then find it on another model. So again, this is a kind of learning task design that they're building a clinical picture together and thereby solving the puzzle together. And by having this physical separation, it's really different from giving a case to students where in a classroom, I'm sure you've all seen this, they're sitting in a room with their laptops open, you ask them a question, and the first thing, the reflex, I'm sure you've all seen, is to just type it into Google, type it into ChatGPT. That's the problem-solving reflex of a student these days. And I think this is really taking them away from that and to say, well, how can we do this? How can we solve it together? So I think this is quite important. We give them this immediate feedback. They know if the code is right or wrong, and we love it when they get it wrong, because they start to discuss and understand why, what have I done wrong, and they start to really engage with the material. So this is just two examples of learning tasks that we design that I think are quite valuable in the gamified learning space. And one of the things that I think is particularly interesting about what we do is we strap these very fancy cameras, it's a GoPro camera, I don't know if you see them, often worn by explorers, to the students themselves. And by doing so, we actually get this kind of image and this kind of video. So we actually see not only generally what the students are learning, but specifically how they discuss, what they discuss for what length of time. And it allows us to do this kind of very detailed, high definition evaluation of what we're doing on a task-by-task basis. So we don't just have a result where it says students were engaged, students learned something. But on the level of the individual task, we can say, whilst the escape room overall was good, this was terrible. We thought it was a great learning task, but as it turns out, they got the answer straight away. Or it was frustrating, too difficult, they started guessing. And this allows us to have that kind of detail. And I think this is quite an important part for any gamified process. What we think as teachers is A, fun, and B, enriching learning task is often wrong. I'm very happy to say, as someone who's been doing this for a while, I'm wrong probably more than I'm right. My estimation of what students will behave is wildly different, probably because I'm quite old now, than how they behave. And I think having the data to see this and adjust is something that's very important to all of us as teachers. We cannot assume what we design it will be used in the way in which we wish. And I think this kind of method is quite helpful. And I'll just give you one example. What can we learn about our students? Well, we can actually look at their behaviors, even the metacognitive behaviors of, oh, I didn't revise this at all, or how is this a good way to learn, the collaborative behaviors. We can see whether they are successful, whether they did discuss different functions or identifying valves or random guessing and so on. And there's quite a lot more data that you can see from the students. And so actually, whilst we're doing this teaching, we also can generate some very interesting research from these kind of research questions. And one of the ones that I'm most curious with, to be honest, is to look at, do students socially construct knowledge in an escape room learning environment that we can look at from a really qualitative and in-depth study. And we can also look at things like what type of learning tasks are associated with constructive and not constructive behavior. We can discuss evaluation and discussion versus frustration and guessing. And we can also look at things like this. And this is something I really want to highlight because before I came over, I had to look on the TDLO website, and it has a page on gaming, on gamification. And it does say that gamification, elements of competition sort of enrich the student learning. But actually, I think it's very fascinating competition. And I think it really depends on the winning conditions. Particularly if you think of escape rooms, we once set a condition that said the fastest team gets an award. This was the very first time we did it. This was quite a terrible mistake when you think of it from a teacher perspective. It encourages the students to push for time rather than learning. So actually, they just rush through. If they get most of the answer, they'll just guess through. We then adjusted the winning condition to say the minimum amount of incorrect answers. And then the students sit around and say, are you sure? Let me double check. I'm not sure if this is actually related to that. And this really changes. So the winning condition physically changes their learning behavior. And I think it's quite fascinating. And we can only see that through the first person perspective of their sort of camera. So I think this is a really interesting way. So I think this is why, at the beginning, I said I have a slightly controversial view on gamification. I don't think some of the things that are listed under gamification always help. And I think competition is one of these really big ones we have to be quite careful with. It often drives winning behaviors that are not actually educational behaviors. And I think this is something that we can really study as scholars. We can look into and say, I want to design a learning task that enriches the learning, and we're not trying to achieve the other outcomes. It's kind of important. One is the other things like the impact of pre-testing on learner performance. So we have done some studies where we compare pre and post-test performance. But of course, if you pre-test students on some material that's within the escape room, it is a kind of prompt. And so the degree to which you want to prompt them is also very interesting. So I think there's a lot of room for scholarly examination of any gamified environments. This is just one example of that. So I think this is just to show you what can be done whilst you're teaching. I think there's a lot of fruitful research that can come out. I'd like to very briefly show you our escape room 2.0, which is moving on from that escape room to try and solve some of the classic problems. They're quite labor intensive, both to design and implement. I'm sure you can imagine it's quite a lot of work from the teacher perspective. They can actually be quite costly, to be honest, and yet they're typically used for just one set of students. You saw the one I taught, that's just for year 2 medical students learning about the heart and the chest. So that's very costly considering the output. So we've tried to solve it with our updated version, which is through sort of modularity and scholarship. And I kind of want to show you what we do now at CU. So we actually divide completely the gamification part and the content part. And myself and my team, as a centralized team, do the design, the story, and the implementation of the escape room, not in a fixed space as it previously was, but by transforming a classroom with lightweight materials, in fact, tents and tunnels, lighting fixations, things that fit in 2 suitcases and a backpack. So a team of 3 can set it up in here. We could probably set it up in a room like this. We also co-design it with students. So no longer is it an old man like me coming up with a story that I think is fun, but we sit with students and really come up with a story that's engaging for them. And then the subject course teachers give the content to go in. And so we develop these kind of generic puzzle frameworks that are adaptable for different disciplines. So I think this has been a really big change for us. Rather than to say, I have a very specific puzzle like the wall that I created, we can actually treat that as a generic puzzle and to fit it in for computer science, for engineering, for my biomedical engineer friends, and so on. So this is the kind of setup, our learning environment that's modular. And actually, you may be really surprised. I didn't put a before photo, but you may be really surprised to see that actually this learning environment is just from a regular classroom. And yet it's full of tunnels and exploration parts and puzzles and divisions that keep students in different places. Took us only an hour and a half or 2 hours to set up. So actually, it's very quick, economical. We use those cheap pull-up banners and hazard tape and things like that. And, you know, we've seen already this idea of communicating ideas across a space. And I would say to you that that is actually a kind of generic puzzle. Any material could have a case here, solution there, and this kind of separated communication without technology. And, you know, colleagues from engineering have done this for circuit board design. So they give us a circuit board design problem. Our colleagues from computer science did a coding one, which was great. So they had a coding program area A and B. And even our legal colleagues came up with the common cases for this was tort law that they came across. And again, it's a communication style. So we really like to look at this perspective now. And I know that none of you are perhaps medical educators, but you'll have from your own disciplines, some potential ideas that you can use in this way. So I hope this is something that will be helpful for you to look at, a sort of general or generic puzzle frame. And we have some reasonable results, but I don't really want to dwell on this because I think this kind of data is often quite misleading. If you give students a sort of fun learning environment, inevitably they'll say it's better than me listening to you in a lecture. So I don't think this is actually super meaningful. I put it just for sake of inclusion. I quite like the fact that they agree with teamwork in critical thinking rather than engagement. I sort of delete that part. And we also do some self-reporters, sort of reporter self-efficacy in tackling problems as well. And we do note that there's quite a big jump in that area. And again, we are moving into other subjects like pharmacy, Chinese medicine, and clinical skills in the future. I'm going to leave you with this first section on this part, which is kind of The least important part is just the data of the smiles of the students. This is my submission here. I think it's obviously in some ways quite trivial, but in some ways our goal was to, in the post-pandemic era, tell to students there's something really meaningful happening at the university. Come back, you'll get a great learning experience. It's fun and you'll gain many things from it. I think we kind of did that. I think there was some degree to which we were successful, and they certainly found it a great meaningful reason to come back. And so this is just something I kind of wanted to share with you about escape room gamification, really. Before we move on to the second section, which is looking at the sort of AI gamification, I wonder if anyone has any questions on this part specifically. If not, no, we will move on to the second part then. So this next part is a really different. So I've been saying I really want to move away from digital and I really want to have a physical learning space. And I'm now going to go into a completely digital direction, but with a slightly classroom perspective still. And this is the use of gamification and digital avatar chatbots, which is sort of a next generation of chatbots. So I think many of these things I don't really need to say anymore, but just for completeness again, I think when we think about what is a chatbot, it's just software that's capable of in some way simulating human conversation. And often it's used to respond to text. This is the one we're most familiar with, I think. But of course, voice, fixed inputs such as option selection. And it's got a very interesting origin, which is, of course, it's from our customer service origin. So I'm sure you've been annoyed by the chatbots in HSBC app, banking app, and the other one, which is like on the weather, Hong Kong Observatory app, and just gets in the way. It's quite annoying, actually. But typically for shops, for example, on Facebook, when they had a Facebook storefront, they'd have some automated replies because they found people would just come in and say, when do you open? And you don't need a human to do that. You can just respond. Typically, they are web-based applications, so we access them through a web browser. And importantly, and unlike humans, I should say, they are able to deploy multimedia on demand. So they're typically able to deploy an image, an audio, and a video, and a web link in the way that me as a human would not be able to do in a very immediate setting. And actually, you can use them in quite a few different settings to kind of give this interactiveness to your classroom. And I often think of it as scaling the conversations between teacher and student as an adjunct and not a replacement. So I actually think there are at least three use cases. The first of which I think is quite interesting, is purely using in a classroom. So depending on your classroom size, chatbots can be used, and I'll give you some demonstrations of how we've done that. The one that I think is the most useful for is actually in terms of hybrid learning, where we have the chatbot supporting physical learning resources as well. And the third one, which is becoming increasingly interesting, is metaverse, pure online, dedicated learning platforms. I think you use Moodle here. I think there's Moodle integrations and so on. And so I'd like to show you through, whilst ChatGPT emerged this year, I've actually been working on educational chatbots for the last 5 years. So I've developed 4.5 generations of different chatbots that we've used in classrooms. And I'd like to show you kind of a quick view of all of them to see how we've changed our classrooms. The very first generation of chatbot that we developed was not a chatbot at all. It's something we call a Wizard of Ozbot. And this image actually represents what we were doing. We told our students, you're going to be talking to a chatbot. And a team of teachers were sitting in the other room, typing the answers out, trying to be as accurate and funny as we could be. This sounds like a very bizarre and illegal thing to do, but I think you can imagine why we would do it. It's a sort of very interesting pilot test to generate a lot of text to and fro conversations on what people actually ask. And again, a lot of what I like to do is to think away from theory, but in real life, how do we really get a conversation? And this was a first modeling type. So our first generation bot was a Wizard of Oz bot. And the second generation was actually a fixed dialogue bot that we called a dialogue flow bot. And this was a fully autonomous cloud computing chatbot that had a fully installed pre-programmed structure. So the students would go through this task list, and it looks the sort of, I won't drag you through the very, very dense medical detail that's there, but you can see that there's a few options. There's a question that we start off with here, and you can see there's a few answers students might give, and they might say no idea. And it would take them through a kind of structured learning pathway as a teacher might do. So if they had no idea, we wouldn't just say, well, the answer is this. We'd take them through and say, well, I'm asking you about this structure. Clearly, it's in the base of the skull somewhere. And the base of the skull is full of these little holes that let things from the brain come through to the body. This is at the back, so what do you think it might be? So this is kind of prompting, hinting type, and you can see our students busily weaving away there. So they access the model through a QR code in the lab, and then they'll use the chatbot to guide them through, in this case, a skull model, and this is sort of them typing away very happily. So that was our second generation chatbot. Our third generation chatbot was actually one of the most fun ones. We had to teach students AI for medicine. And this was therefore the AI squared project, as in an AI that teaches you about AI. So this would answer their questions about what is AI, what is machine learning, what is deep learning. And this was the first time we bridged this gap between a very good performance technological tool that is otherwise quite boring, and having a human element. And we quickly learned that whilst the technology is very impressive when you're texting, it's also a terribly boring way to text to a robot that then tells you quite boring answers. So this was the very first model about 4 years ago that we introduced a personality. So our chatbot wasn't just a chatbot, the chatbot's name was 2-bit. It was sort of cute and had a lot of jokes sort of built in, and would tell quite a few interesting things about deep learning, AI, chatbots, natural language processing, but also, it was a voice bot. You could speak to it. It had quite a personality. Students quite liked it. We sort of tuned it. And I think this is where we first realized that the technology doesn't make it interesting. It only delivers the information. And I think this is something that I'm sure you've found a lot of people are very impressed with ChatGPT, but when you've used it for a while, you're not sitting there saying, this is tremendous fun, I'm just so engaged with it. You're doing it as a service task, as you would do with Google search, I would add, just not so long ago. So this was AI squared. And I'm going to pause there because I want to show you the kind of conversations that are possible in the kind of fixed, because we're still in the fixed area before we move on to the generative area. So I'd actually say, and I'll quickly go through these, there are 4 kind of conversations you can do in this kind of fixed format chatbot: introductions or explications, testing type, task giving, and this sort of paving. And I think if you imagine your class, one of the first things you'd often do, or certainly I do, is I don't stand there and talk the whole time. But when someone comes into a class, I might give them an introductory welcome briefing statement, some fundamentals. What would you say at the beginning of a learning piece? And this is something that can be quite nicely delivered by a chatbot, actually, to the individual person. You might also have knowledge-based questions, MCQs, writing type questions that the chatbot could answer. You might have a task type question. And this is the type that I particularly like, which is where you use a nearby item and you start to get your students to interact with an item in an intellectual way. So you might give it some sort of quiz. And at this point, I'd like to play the second video just to show you how we really used it in our class setting. So I'm going to show you the second generation chatbot. And this is actually 3 and a bit years old now, but this is still, I think, quite relevant to how people use chatbots. So please excuse the slightly cheesy marketing.
AI anatomy.
Sorry, I'll just maximize this. And this to flip.
AI Anatomy is an artificial intelligence chatbot which acts as a fun and flexible adjunct, providing individualized learning in a laboratory setting. Students can choose to let the bot guide them through the station or to ask it any questions. It provides probing questions with instantaneous feedback, all in users' natural language. As student numbers increase, this technology will allow every student to have a personalized learning experience, which is responsive to their learning needs. As a bot, it is knowledgeable, social, and supportive, and it learns as the students learn. It will also provide additional information such as images, video, and audio for students to better understand concepts, to facilitate discussion, and stimulate application of their knowledge to clinical scenarios. But the bot isn't only for students. Educators can access learning analytics built into our bot on students' performance and recognize their individual strengths and weaknesses. This allows customization of individual teaching experiences to be planned and delivered in the future.
So, and you can see that even at that very kind of primitive stage 3 years ago, suddenly it has a use. And I'm not sure how large your classes are, but my classes are 300 students large. They're really, really big classes, and there's often only 1 or 2 teachers. So it's a really good way for us to achieve this kind of scale where every student is going at their own pace. And I think pace to me is one of the most important things. It's one of the things I hate the most about giving lectures, to be honest, is your lecture is only ever appropriate probably for one person at best. And everyone else would either rather you go slightly slower or rather you go slightly faster. And so I think this is a great way for everyone to have in the palm of their hand a text-based tool that can give them this. And this is sort of the origin of what we wanted to do. And you will also see this kind of pathway that works with the early stage bots, which is if this, then that. So it's not right or wrong, but it's multi-pronged. It gives you hints and so on. So I won't dwell too much on this part. But I'm sure you're all looking at me and saying, well, why don't you just use ChatGPT for these functions? If you want chatbots in the classroom, surely you can use ChatGPT. And I'd like to share with you briefly my experience of developing the previous generation of large language model. I'd actually call it a medium-sized language model, which we developed here using not the ChatGPT engine, but Google's BERT, which is the early precursor, the version before ChatGPT, if you like. And I think there are 3 major educational advantages of a simple chatbot that has a little bit pre-programmed pathway rather than using a sort of wild ChatGPT. The first is the control of content. I'm sure you've used ChatGPT enough by now to have picked up significant issues with some of the things it says. It sometimes just has factual, terribly incorrect information, out-of-date information, biased information, and so on. So you can't really control that type if you're using an external tool like ChatGPT, whereas you can if you pre-program your own chatbot. The second thing is there's a certain direction of flow. I would say if you want to retrieve information in a conversational style, there's nothing better than ChatGPT and friends. It is Google search on steroids, if you like. It's just this incredibly powerful tool. But if your students come into a classroom, it's not in a vacuum. They don't arrive and then start retrieving data from you. That's not really how a class works. Often there's a sort of structure to the class where you introduce them fundamental concepts and then get them to apply it and then evaluate and so on. So there's a certain direction to class flow, certainly from the medical perspective, and I'm sure in many subjects too. And so this allows you to control the direction of flow in a way that, again, a ChatGPT would not. And the third one is just predictability. I think often the generative AIs are highly unpredictable in their outcomes, and they can have some fairly unpleasant issues. And there's some other technical advantages about things like copyright, things like cost and complexity. But if you are interested to see medium to large language models pre-programmed for a specific subject, I can direct you to this paper that we wrote on AI-powered chatbot for anatomy using a large language model, and it's there for your information. So please feel free to have a look at that in a bit more detail. I'll kind of show you a few things of what we did. So we actually used it. It was named the ACE system, so the Artificial Intelligence Support System. We used Google DeepMind's BERT, and we trained it ourselves using Microsoft's Azure program. And this was really a true machine learning and AI prediction. It was using text interpretation, so the students could ask it whatever questions it wanted, and it would pull the information not from the generic database, but from our own dedicated AI training database. So we actually customized the information to be limited only to these sources of information. So the UK's General Medical Council approved anatomy syllabus, quite a good document for us to base on, our own CUHK medical syllabus, and then the core textbooks that we assigned to the students. So actually our large language model had a very, very narrow scope. The information was very well controlled and therefore was quite tight and relatively more accurate than a sort of ChatGPT would be about anatomy. And it knew nothing about anything else, which is also quite interesting. And this is how we trained it. So we have a database here where we have a bunch of statements that we can tune in case there's sort of inaccuracies. And we combined it with a kind of another chatbot-related question and answering head that could allow it to generate questions. So not only would you be able to ask the chatbot questions, and I think this is typically the format we use it nowadays. I think all of you use ChatGPT basically to ask it to do things, but we actually implemented this squad to this is a Stanford-based open access tool, Stanford question something. and it would then ask the students questions themselves. So this was quite a different direction from what you typically see for chatbot tools. The chatbot would arrive and it would start asking your students, do you know this, do you know this, and do you know this? It was a little bit different from what other chatbots tend to do. And this was just to address our growing student population and numbers. And you can see a little bit about the interface that we used here. So from our studies in chatbots, there's a few really important common benefits. I think that the number one benefit from introducing this to a classroom is this idea of individualized learning. You have what is essentially a budget teacher that individually sits with a student and goes at their own pace. And if they get it wrong, it can hint them. And for those brilliant students, they don't need the hinting. So it's very individualized. We do see some improved self-reported confidence, and we get to see the learning analytics. And this one is really very important. So if you can imagine as a teacher or as a coordinator of teaching now at a higher level, we can start to see which subjects are frequently queried, which ones are lots of wrong answers, and we start to say, this is an area perhaps that's not been taught very well, or there's some learning related issues. So the analytics is very good. And I want to highlight this. It's very strange for me as a teacher and someone who loves to teach to say non-human interactions is a strong benefit of chatbots. But certainly is, and I want to show you the qualitative statements about this. So I feel more comfortable making mistakes in front of the bot than a teacher. 4.5 out of 5. I feel more comfortable asking questions to the bot compared to the tutor in our practicals, 4.3 out of 5. So you can actually see that in this setting, students are kind of have this safe space to make plentiful mistakes. I think we would all agree to some degree that students learn by making mistakes, and having a grumpy teacher with a beard looking at them saying, oh, I don't think that's correct, is somewhat negative. And therefore having an avenue to have non-human interactions where the mistakes don't really matter that much was really very valuable. And I think this is in a way similar to playing a video game. They have that kind of experience, a lot of freedom to make mistakes. And the final thing is, if you imagine myself walking around an anatomy lab and I'm teaching our students on specimens, I can't open up my chest and play a model, a sort of video or a model and give them things to do. But of course the bot can. And I think the multimedia deployment, link deployment directly to the student's tablet was a very good advantage, and something that we really found was an advantage there. And so what I'd like to do now to be useful is to try and do a pedagogical analysis of where could you perhaps deploy AI chatbots to kind of gamify and enrich your learning classrooms. And I've done this pedagogical analysis of a famous UK institution. I'm sorry, it's not a higher education level. It's a school level, but the subject is quite advanced. And they conduct a really interesting flipped classroom with practical elements and small group work. You might recognize it. Just tell me if you've seen this institution before. It's actually from Harry Potter. So I actually did a very serious analysis of their classrooms, because I actually think Harry Potter classrooms are quite sophisticated in terms of their teaching philosophy. They actually do it in quite an interesting way. And I picked Professor Severus Snape's potions class. Are we all familiar? First of all, is anyone completely lost with this? You all know what I'm talking about, right? Good. And so there is some class structure when you look at the books and the video and the movies, where they have this 5-step structure. So they have a pre-reading that's actually assigned to them. Hermione, typically the one who does it, and the other ones not so much. And then Snape will come up to the front and he'll give an introduction to the class, and he'll often give a demonstration of what's going on. And then they do this very small group work where they have individual or pairs, and they do a technical task. And often there's an individual teacher that goes around to provide guidance, but their classroom is 30 plus students. So it's actually quite difficult for him to give directed guidance at a timely important. Other things that in Professor Snape's class, he has to do things like bullying Harry Potter, supporting Draco Malfoy, and so on. And then, of course, he'll have a wrap-up at the end of the class. So you can imagine, in addition to the flow, there are some overarching activities that if you watch all of his classes, he does all the time. So number one, some professionalism-related things. So you have to be quiet, you have to behave a certain way. And he also has to do pastoral care things. I'm sure we all have this as well, awarding points to houses, Gryffindor, and so on. So this is what he does. And I would say that if I were to consult with Severus Snape, I would say actually there's quite a lot of opportunity to introduce AI into his classrooms, specifically for here, for example, to give a standard overview and context to the class on an individual level. He doesn't have to stand at the front to do it. It's something that could be delivered by a chatbot, multimedia to the tablets at that time. And importantly, unlike him giving it once at the beginning of class, if someone is late, it doesn't matter. They can have it at their own timing. If someone misses something he says or wants it to go slower or wants to see it again, they can. And this is a really important part to even the most basic function, giving an introduction to a class. An AI chatbot would immensely help this class, I'm sure. The second thing is to give individual feedback to classes. And I want to highlight the transformation potion. They often get it wrong, but there's some feedback they get. They add the ingredient and it turns a certain color. It shouldn't. And therefore, you can input this to the chatbot. And again, it can support struggling students and troubleshoot issues. It can also do this, which I think is really interesting. Imagine Hermione, typically, and the other one who's very talented. They go very fast. They finish. They want extra material. Now, if the chatbot detects they've got to the end of the class, it can deploy, of course, extra learning tasks, extra things for them to do, really engage them and stimulate their interest without the teacher having to be alert to that event. It can be done automatically. So I think this is really taking away a bunch of scalable tasks. And I hope that all of you perhaps can look at your class in detail and say, well, I think this is quite a scalable activity. And then there are things that only the teacher could do. And these must remain. So in his case, it's sort of Harry Potter things and professionalism things. So I think this is a nice way to look at everyone's individual class to say, what can I scale? What could be delivered by chatbot and multimedia? And what must be delivered by me? And I think this is perhaps what I wanted to show you here. And of course, multimedia, particularly for repeated classes. I don't know if any of you have to repeat the same class to deliver the same class on multiple occasions, but for medical school, we often do because of the sheer numbers. And again, this is something that would be important. And again, to provide feedback for the students as they brew the potions. And I think very interesting, the reason I came up with this idea is actually the last one. I don't know if you've read Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. There is actually a magical kind of chat by MI, magical intelligence chatbot, because the book is alive with magic and it actually gives them feedback. So actually that's where I got the idea from, to be honest. It's not an original idea. And so I think this is conserving cognitive attention. I think this is really important, as well as things like role modeling and professionalism demonstration, and addressing issues that are not covered by the AI. This is perhaps the last thing I'd say. I think it's very interesting that if you have an AI doing tasks around the classroom, you can very quickly see what can be covered and what can't. And every year you can develop the chatbot based on your new. So it's sort of an evolving thing. I don't think this is a static tool at all. You can continue to evolve it. But anyway, that's just my sort of small look at the chatbots. And then I'd like to talk about how do we develop our conversational pathways. And I've talked about Wizard of Oz already, so I won't dwell onto that. Of course, you can pre-write the pathways, but I want to show you the third option here, which is what we do for our fourth generation chatbot, which I'm going to end on. It's our last bit for today, and that is our digital avatar bot. So how do we get really good conversation modeling? So actually what we do is we get dedicated teaching sessions from this is one of our very talented professors doing a one-on-one teaching session that we record from 3 angles with an individual student. And we actually generate lots of these model interactions where it's going to be someone, how would you be if you sat with your student and took them through your class one by one on an individual level? What would you say? How might you speak to them? What kind of examples would you give? And we use machine translation of the audio, and we map the real conversation using Miro software and sort of a branch tree, and we generate visual materials. We take the best of the human part, their explanations, the analogies, the fine detail of the teaching interaction to generate the conversation. And that's really quite different from just sitting in your classroom and speculating what might happen. I think this is a really nice way to make it quite human and quite authentic. And this is what we do to develop our final generation bot. And this is the 4th generation chatbot, which after all of what we've been seeing, the text bots, what we found is people really don't like texting to their tablet or device for very long periods. They can do it, but it's not a very exciting classroom. And so taking a kind of inspiration from video game and gamification, we've developed this avatar-based bot. So this is actually me, obviously, me real speaking, talking bot. And what we wanted to do, number one, is reduce the user friction. We find that the technology for all of the chatbots is very good, but people just don't like sitting there typing and making spelling mistakes. So we reduce the options to press button and voice options, so A, B, C, D, yes or no. Nice and simple, can be voice-based. We have a logic-based chatbot. And again, we use the learning task that I showed you before to have to bridge that physical digital divide. But this time we try to make it immersive, character-driven interactivity. So it's not just a simple text bot giving you answers, but it's someone trying to be, and this is trying, of course, to be as engaging and interactive and funny as they can be. I think there are some specific advantages to this approach that we've now deployed in our classrooms for this year. And the first one is that actually there's a lot of branching logic in the AI. So our classrooms are run by my chatbots. So I have 300 students running around, and I just walk around the classroom putting out fires or just, finding things to do, essentially. We have great learning analytics from all of our students who interact with the talking bot. It's completely hallucination-free, and this is the technical term for making up facts that the generative AIs often do. Ours is completely free from that. And the nice thing is that it's a real-time updating bot. We use a cloud platform for it. Students access it via QR code. And if there's any issues that arise even in the classroom, they can be updated on the fly. And that's actually surprisingly useful to have a real-time updating bot in a way that you couldn't at all do with a generative AI. That is a model that's been built around its prefix training, and to fix its problems, you would need to go back and retrain it against another body of data. So it's actually quite a significant advantage. And a lot of people say, well, this is a lot of work. It's a lot of human work. You're telling me I need to go and record a human sitting with another student, map the conversation pathway, and then give an interesting conversation. This seems like a lot of work. Can't you do things like this? And I would say yes, but. So this is the yes, but, the future of chatbots, which is video avatars, deep fakes, text to voice. I'm sure you've all seen the videos of Barack Obama saying terrible things that he wouldn't really. It's all done by computer. Synthetic media. Can we use synthetic media for teaching powered by chatbots? And I would say definitely yes, but. And I've seen them used before. And I must say there's a specific use case that I want to demonstrate to you here. This is kind of my last point, because this is fully integrated chatbots that are actually generative AIs in video games, for example. So this character is explaining that his ramen shop was attacked by sort of bad people and so on. So they can, chatbots that are fully automated can provide appropriate responses, but they are very, very not human. And they're detectably boring and routine. And I want to show you one very important thing. It may come as some surprise to you. I spent quite a lot of time playing this particular video game. I assume that none of you have spent any time playing this game. But in case my bosses are listening, it's not playing this game. I've been undertaking primary immersive digital avatar research. That's what I've been doing. And I think one thing that's very fascinating, the reason I find this game a very good inspiration for gamification and chatbots is because of this. It actually stars the one and only Keanu Reeves. Now, no matter whether or not you like Keanu Reeves, I think it's fair to say that his job is actually to engage people through a video screen. That's literally what he does. He's an expert in that field. And I think it's really important that when you play the game, there are lots of other characters that you walk past and they say random things, and you couldn't care less. No one really cares. But when his character speaks, it's a completely huge world of difference. I'm sort of on the edge of my seat. Even as an old man, I'm sort of very, very engaged with these things. And I think the point I want to make here is that although generative chatbots, synthetic media saves a lot of time on the production side, it definitely does. There's no doubt about it. I don't think that's where the main benefit of the teaching deployment is. I actually think if you are a teacher, you always spend a lot of time in the design aspect. You always do. There's no way to get around that. The production side is always very busy. And I think that AI is a great way to use technology to deliver it to students at scale at a personal level. I don't think it's a good way for us to say, type your lecture notes into a text and you'll get a talking head. Because even if you get a talking head, they're never like humans. And I think this is an important point. So my final slide on this, in the role of chatbots and human simulators, the technology is very impressive, and I think lots of people love it. But to me, at least from my opinion, and again, I have some controversial opinions, this is one of them, I feel that there's an ill-defined quality I've yet to actually be able to very nicely describe, and yet there is a quality that separates humans from AI agents. And I think it's not only the voice and the expressions and the presentation, although it is as well, but I think there's this thing that when there's a human that's put in a lot of effort that really cares about the students' learning, there's something in that that comes across in the class, I think. I really think that. And that can never be replaced by a fancy technology. So my sort of last point with this is please be careful of falling in love with the technology. So you've listened to me for a very long time, so I just have a couple of conclusions for this. I think the first thing is that, at least from my perspective, if you're doing gamification, it's the learning task design that's our number one, first and foremost goal. And everything else in gamification, the story, the design, the fun parts, they just support a good learning task. If you have a beautiful game set up with lousy learning tasks, it will not get you anywhere. And I think these are to support quality learning tasks. And I think having a scholarly evaluation of that is very important. I think for me, chatbots is another great way for students to focus on high quality activities and tasks, to get rid of repetitive, small, mundane tasks. But I think humanness for me is very difficult to replace in chatbots for education. And that's not just because I want to remain employed for the rest of my, employable life, but also that I really kind of believe it. I think being human in a classroom, there's something that can never really be replaced. And I hope that's kind of good news for all of us here. And with that, I'd like to say thank you so much for your attention today. Thank you very much. And I'm very happy to take any questions and comments. Sorry, how long this runs? I think I can reach it.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for the presentation. So it is an area that I've spent quite some years on that, and therefore I'm very interested. And it's good to see that to have this kind of concept like gamification and serious games, those kind of things, to be extended to a relatively very professional subject. So say, for example, in the past, we are talking about using this, I collaborated with a teacher in PolyU. So we just use that to train student project management skill. So it is like some soft stuff, but now we really focus trying to extend that to the relatively more professional things. And actually, I don't have much a very specific question over here, but some comment about the last part. So I totally agree with you about the students do care about the teachers. Like I think they're a little bit more about the empathy. So they someone will respond a little bit to the teacher, so that the teacher will have some being motivated to keep going. So yeah, very interesting presentation. I love it a lot. Yeah.
Any other?
Yeah, a little bit. Shouldn't have a lot, but thanks very much. You said in the very beginning that gamification is something that we know, but actually, I do not think I know anything about gamification before your lecture. So thank you very much for that. Well, with the resources, I think you're from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. There are quite a number of people, quite a lot of resources put into building these kinds of classroom. Especially the what is called, what do you call it? It's the escape room. Haven't tried that before. That sounds very dangerous to me from a legal perspective. But then, given those resources and those people, human resources put into the classrooms, what would you say is the percentage of classes having that kind of games in it? And what's the percentage of classes still being delivered in a very traditional way?
That's a great question. I mean, I think we have to be cautious of over gamifying. I think not every class can be like that. So for us, we have one for the end of each semester. So they will typically have small group teaching, tutorials, practical labs, and lectures. And the gamified environment would normally come towards the end of their semester for semester 1 and semester 2. So they only have 2 classrooms like this per year, per academic year. So it's not so widespread. We want to make it a part of the curriculum, but not to take over the curriculum, sort of complementary, if you like. I think so.
Students can put together what they've learned for the end of the semester, but end of that course, so that they can actually apply what they've learned very practically into the classroom or into a form of test or something, because they need to solve all these issues before they can get out of the room or before they can talk to the chat box more meaningfully. Well, that's interesting. What would be your advice to us if we're starting to build all these kind of structure or these kind of platforms for private university?
I think probably 2 big things. Probably start small, aim big. And so by what I mean is, actually our development started off with prototyping a single puzzle. So not making an escape room, just designing a single puzzle, actually a very cheap plastic box with some things in it. as a model to understand how people approach it. And we asked students to come and solve this problem at the end of a classroom. And so, this was the way we started with learning design first. And the decorations and the sound design and the padlocks and things is right at the end. It's the icing, the very thin icing on the substantial cake of learning. I think this is, so that would be my number one advice, is always to start with piloting the individual unit of learning. And with those 10 or 20 individual units of learning, you can assemble something very nice. And I think the second thing is, for funding, you're right to say, can be quite costly. And I think often the university have teaching related grants or teaching support, and is it not not Hmm. 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 Yeah. So it might be probably then collaborations and things. I think it does need some sort of funding. I think so, yeah.
Teaching that video.
Mm.
And together with research, and then you collaborate with those staff.
Mm.
They will be kind of give you the support, and perhaps they have structured something that
Mm.
because they want to gain some reputation about that.
And I would say, actually, you may be surprised that our room looks quite fancy. It's incredibly low budget. So I have a budget for 1.5 student helpers who carry the equipment. We put all the equipment in 2 cheap suitcases and wheel it around the campus. And then we have several of these banners that pull up from the floor, some iPads taken from another grant budget that we kind of use to unlock, padlocks from One Chime Market that are $12 for a pack of 5, flashlights from the same shop. So it actually, you'd be quite, but it can look quite nice and is very immersive. And yet the bill is not so very high. I think this is my. Any other?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. C, right? Yeah, well, it's very fascinating because it reminds me of perhaps learning English or improving my English through playing PlayStation games. And I'm not sure if you are in that period or not. Well, I saw your presentations in the for the first part, and I think this very such immersive environment really, I think it really helps the students to engage or to devote it into learning. Well, well, because I work, I'm a project administrator working on one project, online self-learning gamified as well. Yeah. So under Dr. Jason Chow, who's unfortunately not here today. Well, because this in our university is rather more humanity, yeah. So a lot about values and ethics, yeah, instead of the technical stuffs. So I wonder if your research or your projects would it includes any designs that is compatible for the values or ethics learning?
That's really interesting. Quite a difficult problem. I think sometimes an ethics classroom can often be quite difficult. My very rudimentary understanding of like an ethics classroom would be maybe introduction of some basic principles, the history of philosophy in that branch, some applied cases, looking at real world ethical conundrum, having students discuss and having the teacher feedback. So having looked at them, and I'm just synthesizing this right now, so I don't have a pre-prepared answer, but I think for these kind of scenarios, as I'm envisaging now, you can imagine that some of these things could be automated. So for example, I think the delivery of a small case discussion amongst your group could be introduced quite nicely with media and chatbot as a small group. So say you had 4 discussion classes, each one needs to report to the class at the end what they think, and the tutor will give them feedback. Each ethical case could be delivered to the student via the chatbot, and you could have some basic functions where it would you could discuss the main principles involved, some historical examples, and so on. Probably I'd need to think about it a bit more because I'm not a humanities person, so my brain is but I feel that there's some, even with a discursive type interaction, I think that there's that. The other thing to say is that I think the chatbot can facilitate some discussions. And I've seen these software where, for example, if someone is not contributing, it can prompt you to say, so Jimmy and Bob have answered a lot, but Elizabeth hasn't. What do you think? And so this is another way to, without the tutor, to make sure that you have a prompting system, electronic facilitation chatbot. So that's another way to look at it. So at least I think there's some ways to apply to the humanities and more of this kind of subjects. Any last comments? Great. Well, with that, thank you again for your time and your attention. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Feel free to get in touch if you have any questions.